events that Zagreb is organizing. It's great to have you here. I'm particularly proud that we managed to organize the first live event in the faculty premises. Many of you have not...
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, partially in physical form, partially in hybrid form, and I would like to greet you all. I have to apologize. I am a Dutch ambassador who has been here for over 2 years, and I do not speak Croatian. And secondly, although I'm in the law faculty, I'm not a lawyer, although I spent 25 years of my life with a woman who is, and I learned a lot from her. But don't expect me to answer very complicated legal questions because they're too complex for me. I gladly invited the invitation to say something about the experience in the Netherlands over the years. And perhaps that experience is best illustrated if you think back of the final of the Eurovision Song Contest in Rotterdam on the 22nd of May of this year, so 3 weeks ago. At the end, one of the hosts, a Dutch transgender called Nicky de Jager, handed over the prize, the crystal microphone, the winner's trophy, to the non-binary singer of the Italian band Måneskin, and the crowd was cheering. This represents, in a way, the openness, which was the theme of the Eurovision Song Contest in Rotterdam, the openness of our society. But 70 years earlier, in the 1950s, you were not able to get a job as a civil servant in the Netherlands if you admitted to being homosexual. The Netherlands was then still a very conservative country, politically dominated by Christian political parties. To give an example, a married woman had no legal right to open a bank account, for instance, on her own without her husband's permission, until 1956. If a female civil servant got married, she had to give up her job, a condition only abolished in 1957. I still remember from when I was a child the unmarried female teachers, women who gave priority to their professional careers at the expense of their private life. But even in conservative post-war Netherlands, post-war after the Second World War, something was changing in our society. In a survey in Western countries in the mid-1950s, the Dutch presented themselves as modern, coming only second after the citizens of the United States of America. So what happened in the Netherlands? And how come things happen so fast? In a way, our society in the mid-1960s was simply catching up, and catching up fast. Perhaps joining the wave of rapid social change that swept the Western world. The introduction of the contraceptive pill in the Netherlands in the early 1960s not only had an immediate demographic effect, in particular in the Catholic parts of the country, where the number of children had by women was far larger than in the Protestant parts, it also gave a boost to movements to long overdue female emancipation. I would say that what happened between 1955 and 1965 in the Netherlands illustrates the argument that Alexis de Tocqueville made about the French Revolution. Institutions can remain in place, laws can remain in place until somebody says, let's get rid of them, and then they appear or disappear rapidly. Also in the early 1960s, homosexuality, in particular male homosexuality, became a topic of public discourse, with writers and actors speaking out publicly. Then things started to move fast. Homosexual practices were legalized for those over 16 in 1971. And in 1973, homosexuals were allowed to join the armed forces. And not on the principle, don't ask, don't tell, as the American army uses. By the way, until that time, claiming to be a homosexual male was the easiest way to evade military service, although it could damage your career prospects. At that time, in medical circles, the existence of phenomena like transgender and intersex had been well established long before, in fact. In a way, science was ahead of values in society. In the Netherlands, our legislation tried to accommodate in particular transgender interests. In 1985, it became legally possible to get the status registered in your passport, but it was linked to certain conditions. Think of chemical treatment, inducing physical change, but also infertility. These phenomena were only improved upon by new legislation in 2014. But going back to the 1960s, I would say that one of the consequences of the emancipation wave of that period was the rapid growth of people living together without getting married, in particular in the case of heterosexual relationships. This issue was addressed only legally in the 1990s. In 1998, it became possible to conclude a registered partnership, which was as close as one would get without being married. The legislation aimed at the protection of the rights of both spouses, as well as of their children, adopted or not. Now, this option has a long history where one could already arrange many issues through a notary on an individual basis. But this legislation covered it, so to speak, completely and made things a lot easier. And then on the 1st of April 2001, the Netherlands introduced the same-sex marriage option. It's the first country in the world. This was to a large extent symbolic, since mutual rights and obligations could be arranged for differently, as I just mentioned. But it had a huge impact also due to global media coverage. Now, one may wonder why people with a different gender orientation adhere so much value to what is, in effect, a bourgeois ceremony like marriage. But they did, and they still do. Interestingly, in the Netherlands, nowadays the number of female same-sex marriages exceeds the number of male ones considerably. Since the 1960s, many pressure and interest groups have been active in the area of recognition of special gender status in our country, and not without result. A major achievement was the adaptation of the legislation on transgenders in 2014 that I already mentioned. Then the obligation for medical expert advice was scrapped. The registration with the civil authorities was eased, and the procedure was open to everyone over 16, even without parental consent. In 2018, an advisory body evaluated the legislation and advised the government to abolish the expert review altogether and to open up to the opportunity for transgender interventions for everyone over 12 years of age. The Dutch government is looking upon these advices with a positive attitude. Another step forward was the government's decision to introduce the qualification X in your passport as an alternative for male or female. This happened in 2018. At the same time, the European Parliament adopted a decision to make the gender registration in EU-approved ID cards optional. The Dutch government has followed this line of reasoning and is currently avoiding any gender registration where possible in official documents, and that is almost everywhere. It should be kept in mind here that the Dutch government's policies regarding LGBTI are not just national policies. Our constitution obliges the government to promote the international respect for the rule of law and human rights. And the protection of LGBTI rights anywhere in the world is one of the 5 priority areas of the Dutch foreign policy on human rights, thus also here in Croatia. The current Dutch government, a demissionary government since they resigned some months ago, adopted a coalition program in 2017 in which the objective was included to add sexual orientation as a ground for the right to non-discrimination under Article 1 of our Constitution. This is still currently in judicial and political review, but I'm confident that it will pass. This government also introduced various action plans, like the one on Government 2025, issued in June 2018, focusing on the promotion of diversity and inclusivity in the civil service, but also defining specific objectives for specific communities in Dutch society. Think of bicultural communities, Orthodox Christian communities, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Not everybody coming from abroad shares the view of our government and society in these matters. Furthermore, the government supports specific initiatives like Pink in Blue, an initiative for the police force whose uniforms are nowadays black, but they used to be blue. The people involved in this initiative provide confidence staff members for victims of gender-related violence, for example. Or to mention another example, gay-straight alliances in schools to make discussions between school kids on these topics easier. After all, legislation is one matter, implementation and broad acceptance are another. In 2019, the Action Plan on Safety for LGBTI 2019 to 2021 was adopted. And last year, after consultation with interest groups, including insurance companies, the future vision on transgender care was published. The practical problem due to the COVID crisis being, of course, that medical interventions regarding transgender processes do not score highly on the priority list of urgent medical care. But as in Croatia, I am glad to say that the situation in the Netherlands is now improving rapidly regarding new COVID infections. Now, for the time being, terms like gender fluidity and switching between binary and non-binary orientations are not on the government's agenda. Since these phenomena have a nature that relies more on psychological and social dimensions and its manifestations than requiring legal regulation to guarantee equal treatment. All of these developments are taking place in a society that is to a large extent tolerant, almost indifferent. We are a nation of very individualistic people, and we, over the centuries, have shown respect or acceptance for what other people wanted. But there are exceptions. In the Netherlands, the two most important pockets of resistance, if I may call them so, are Orthodox Protestant movements and conservative Muslim communities, in particular the Moroccan one. You should realize that we, in the 1960s, had an immigration of migrant workers, and particularly from Morocco and Turkey, who were later joined by the members of their family. In Orthodox Protestant circles, schools for instance, churches, under the impact of conservative, mostly American movements, any deviation from the proper, between brackets, sexual orientation is criticized and condemned. In particular, many young people in these circles struggle with this, and the government tries to be of assistance. The Dutch Parliament last year adopted a motion to ask the government to prohibit the practice of prayer healing of homosexuality, as it involves extreme psychological pressure. The government is, for legal reasons, reluctant, but that drew a reaction from our parliament, and last Friday some members of our parliament, in particular in the liberal sector of our parliament, announced the introduction of a draft law on this topic. Now, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I can imagine that there are legal difficulties in the area of individual freedoms and pressure put on individuals. In our Muslim communities, consisting of some 8 to 9% of our total population, and often centered in big cities, the rule is extreme conservatism in sexual matters. Homosexuality is often considered to be incompatible with Islam. It is very difficult and sometimes even dangerous for young people with a different sexual orientation to come out, as it often has the inevitable consequence of breaking off of all ties with your family, your friends, and the community as a whole. At the same time, in particular, young men, mostly with Muslim Moroccan roots, are active in the homosexual scene, either for financial reasons, because of their orientation, or both. In this context, in the Netherlands, the continuing violence against, in particular, openly homosexual men is hotly debated. Is it primarily macho behavior of young adults as such? Also, Dutch young men are involved in this? Or should it predominantly be explained by the value system in which these young men have been brought up? The debate continues. In addition, I would like to mention the public debate that has been started recently in our society on homosexuality in sports circles, in particular in football, as we are preparing for the European Championships. Many young and promising players are reluctant to come out because they fear in particular that it might endanger potential international careers, the gateway to becoming football millionaires in view of prevailing values in other countries. Also, the football public can hardly be described as tolerant to homosexuality, in a misinterpretation, I would say, of male virility. Interestingly, in the successful women's football competition, this is far less of an issue. On the other hand, if there is one category in society that can make a difference, in particular among young people with a migratory background, it is football players. Just look at the composition of the Dutch national football team. Some of them are black, from our former colonies. Some of them have Moroccan names. It is a very diverse football team, I would say. But it's very difficult to engage them in the topic of coming out on these issues. Finally, I would like to say a few words on social media. It appears that the use of social media not only facilitates finding partners of whatever sexual orientation one would prefer, but also includes risks of abuse, violence, and blackmail. The lover boy phenomenon that we started to experience in the 1980s was only a start. But as long as society as a whole does not accept the many different manifestations of gender identity, sexual orientation, and the equality of rights of all, these problems will continue to exist. We have made considerable progress in our country, but even for us there is still quite a long way to go, because legislation may be of fundamental importance, implementation and above all social acceptance are as well. I thank you for your attention and I'm open for any questions or comments.